It was the late summer of 1944, deep inside an Allied-controlled German prisoner of war camp in southern Italy, where the war felt distant yet painfully present. The front lines were shifting, but inside the barbed wire fences, time moved slowly, measured only by hunger, roll calls, and the endless waiting. Canvas tents sagged under the Mediterranean heat, their seams stained dark with sweat and dust. Boots crunched over dry gravel. Somewhere, a guard's radio crackled faintly with news from the front, half understood, half ignored. For the German prisoners, defeat was no longer a rumor. It was a taste in the mouth, metallic and bitter. They were not starving skeletons, but they were thin, worn, and hollowed by uncertainty. Their uniforms hung loose. Their faces carried the strain of men who had once believed the war would end differently. Food was survival, nothing more. No one expected surprise. No one expected kindness. And certainly no one expected something unfamiliar. Then, one ordinary afternoon, an Allied camp cook stepped forward with a metal tray. The smell came first. Warm bread, melted cheese, something sweet and sharp beneath it. The prisoners shifted, suspicious. Their instincts screamed caution. In wartime, generosity was dangerous. Yet the cook smiled, calm, unarmed, almost casual, as if offering not rations, but a moment of normal life stolen from another world. In that silent space between enemy and captor, something small but irreversible was about to happen. A moment where food became more than sustenance, and perception quietly began to change. The tray was placed down slowly on the rough wooden table, the dull scrape of metal against splintered wood sounding far louder than it should have inside the quiet tent. It was a small sound, almost insignificant, yet every man standing there heard it. The German prisoners had learned to notice details like that. Sudden noises often meant commands, inspections, or punishment. Instinctively, several of them straightened their backs. Others narrowed their eyes. No one spoke. The air was thick with dust, and the lingering smell of canvas heated by the sun mixed with sweat, old fabric, and the faint soreness of boiled rations that clung permanently to the camp. Then another smell cut through it. Warm, rich, unmistakably different. Melted cheese, toasted bread, and beneath it something sweet, sharp, and almost confusing. At first, their minds rejected what their senses were telling them. This was a prisoner of war camp in 1944. Food was measured, repetitive, and joyless by design. Meals were something to endure, not examine. Yet there it was, sitting openly between captor and captive, round slices of bread covered in bubbling cheese, edges browned, oil catching the light, topped with small golden pieces of fruit that glistened faintly. Pineapple. Most of the men had never seen it before in their lives. Exotic fruit belonged to peacetime markets, not to barbed wire and guards with rifles. The prisoners shifted without realizing it, boots scraping softly across the dirt floor. A few leaned forward, their bodies betraying them. Hunger had a way of overriding discipline. One man's stomach growled loudly, and he flushed with embarrassment, glancing sideways to see if anyone had noticed. They all had. No one mocked him. They were all thinking the same thing. The smell was maddening, salty and sweet colliding in a way that felt almost cruel after months of thin soup and dry bread. It stirred memories they had tried to bury: family kitchens, bakeries on city streets, meals eaten without counting bites or watching the clock. Still, no one reached out. War had trained them well. Kindness was often followed by cost. A trick, perhaps. A test. Some form of psychological game meant to humiliate them. One prisoner, older than the rest, clenched his jaw and stared hard at the food, as if daring it to disappear. Another whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Was ist das?" "What is that?" The question hung unanswered in the air. The Allied cook stood opposite them, hands relaxed at his sides, his posture casual in a way that felt almost unsettling. He wore a stained apron over his uniform, sleeves rolled up, forearms marked with old burns and scars from years in kitchens rather than battlefields. He did not carry a weapon. He did not shout. He simply nodded once and gestured toward the tray, a small movement of the hand, slow and deliberate. "Take it," that was all. No command, no threat. Just an offer. The silence stretched. Somewhere outside the tent, a guard coughed. A fly buzzed lazily near the canvas wall. Time seemed to thicken, every second heavy. The prisoner's thoughts raced. If this was allowed, why? If it was a trick, what kind? One man thought of his mother's voice, warning him never to accept gifts from strangers. Another remembered propaganda films that showed smiling enemies hiding cruelty behind civility. Their training clashed violently with their hunger. Finally, one prisoner stepped forward. He was not the strongest or the weakest, not the youngest or the oldest. Just tired. His boots were worn thin. His uniform faded to a dull grey-green. He hesitated only a moment before extending his hand. It trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the effort of restraint finally giving way. His fingers brushed the crust, and he flinched at the warmth. Real warmth. Not imagined, not symbolic. The slice was solid, weighty, unmistakably food. He lifted it slowly, as though expecting someone to stop him. No one did. The cook watched calmly. The guards remained where they were. The prisoner raised the slice closer to his face, breathing it in. Cheese stretched slightly as he adjusted his grip, oil glistening on his fingers. His mouth felt dry. He took a cautious bite. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then his eyes widened, just slightly, enough that everyone noticed. His brow furrowed, confusion rippling across his face. He chewed slowly, deliberately, as if trying to understand what he was tasting. The sweetness of the pineapple cut sharply through the salt and fat of the cheese, lighting up senses dulled by monotony. It was strange. It was unexpected. And it was good. Very good. A murmur passed through the group, quiet but electric. Another man stepped forward, then another. The unspoken permission spread quickly. Hands reached out, some careful, some suddenly urgent. The tray lightened as slices were taken. The sound of chewing filled the tent, awkward and intimate. For a moment, no one knew where to look. Some stared at the food in their hands, as if it might vanish. Others watched the cook, searching his face for hidden intent. Expressions changed rapidly. Suspicion softened into disbelief. Disbelief into something dangerously close to relief. One prisoner let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Another closed his eyes briefly as he chewed, as though grounding himself in the sensation. The pineapple shocked them most. Sweet, bright, almost playful. It did not belong here. And yet, it was here. Boots shuffled closer. Men who moments before had stood stiff and distant now crowded around the table, careful not to push, not to break the fragile calm. The tent seemed warmer, fuller, alive in a way it hadn't been for months. The war did not disappear, but it faded to the edges, drowned out by small human sounds, chewing, swallowing, the faint scrape of crust against teeth. No one spoke loudly. Conversation, when it came, was hushed, fragmented. Unglaublich, someone whispered, unbelievable. Another shook his head slowly, a faint, incredulous smile tugging at his mouth before he caught himself. Smiling felt almost forbidden. The cook watched them eat, his expression neutral but not cold. He did not rush them. He did not count. He simply stood there, a silent witness to something he likely did not fully realize the weight of. For the prisoners, this was not just food. It was disruption. It broke the rigid script of enemy and captive. It introduced doubt, and with it humanity. For those few minutes, the tent was no longer just a holding space for defeated soldiers. It became something else entirely, a place where the rules bent, where hunger met kindness, where perception shifted quietly but permanently. And as the last crumbs fell onto the scarred wooden table, every man there understood, even if he could not yet put it into words, that this moment would stay with him far longer than the taste itself. As the last slice was taken from the tray, the immediate hunger began to fade, but something far more complicated took its place. The men did not step back right away. They lingered, holding the crusts in their hands, licking grease from their fingers almost self-consciously, as if embarrassed to be seen enjoying something so openly. The tent felt different now. The air itself seemed altered, lighter, charged with a quiet unease that had nothing to do with fear of punishment and everything to do with uncertainty. This was unfamiliar territory. Hunger they understood, orders they understood, but this small, unexpected generosity did not fit into any framework the war had prepared them for. The prisoners began to look at one another differently. Earlier, their eyes had been sharp, guarded, constantly measuring threats. Now, glances lingered. A man caught another smiling faintly and quickly looked away, unsure if it was permitted. Someone let out a short, breathy laugh, more a reflex than a choice, and immediately stiffened, waiting for a shout that never came. The sound echoed strangely in the tent, as foreign as the pineapple had been moments before. Silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was thoughtful. The Allied guards remained at their posts, rifles slung casually, posture relaxed. This detail did not go unnoticed. The prisoners had been trained to read body language as a survival skill, and what they saw unsettled them. There was no tension in the guards' shoulders, no impatience in their stance. They were not watching the prisoners the way one watches enemies or livestock. They were simply there, present but distant. It suggested confidence, perhaps even trust, and that realization gnawed at the prisoners' assumptions. One man wiped his mouth slowly with the back of his hand and stared at the empty tray. He had expected guilt to follow pleasure, some internal punishment for enjoying food given by the enemy. Instead, what he felt was confusion. He had spent years absorbing the idea that surrender meant degradation, that captivity meant cruelty masked by smiles. And yet nothing bad had followed. No insult, no mockery, no sudden barked order to fall in line. The moment simply continued. Quiet conversation began to ripple through the group, low and cautious at first. Words were chosen carefully, as if spoken too loudly might break whatever fragile truce had formed. One prisoner muttered that it tasted better than anything he had eaten since before the war. Another nodded, adding that he had never imagined such food existed at all. Pineapple, he said the word slowly, testing it. A third man shrugged and said nothing, but his expression betrayed something deeper than appreciation. It was disorientation. This was how perceptions began to shift, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, uncomfortable increments. The food had forced them to confront an inconvenient truth. The enemy was capable of restraint, capable of choice, capable of treating them as men rather than symbols. That realization was unsettling because it demanded something in return. Not gratitude, but honesty. It required them to question stories they had carried for years, stories that had justified hatred and hardened them against doubt. Later that evening, after roll call and the return to routine, the memory of the meal followed them into the dim barracks. Men sat on their bunks, boots unlaced, the bodies exhausted but minds restless. Normally, nights were filled with familiar sounds: coughing, muttered curses, the creak of wood, the quiet despair of waiting. This night, the tone was different. Conversations lingered longer. Voices stayed low but engaged. Someone mentioned the cook again. Someone else wondered aloud why such food was wasted on prisoners. The word, wasted, hung in the air, and no one felt comfortable with it. One prisoner, younger than most, stared at the ceiling and thought of home. Not of marching bands or speeches, but of his father slicing bread at the kitchen table, of meals eaten without hurry. The taste of pineapple returned to him unexpectedly, vivid enough that he swallowed hard. He had not realized how long it had been since food had reminded him of life beyond survival. That realization frightened him more than hunger ever had. It exposed how much the war had narrowed him. Across the room, an older man spoke quietly about surrender. Not in shame, but in practicality. He said that perhaps captivity did not have to mean the end of dignity. The others listened without interruption. In the past, such talk might have sparked anger or accusations of weakness. Tonight, it did not. The pizza had not made them forget their losses or their dead, but it had softened the edges of inevitability. It introduced the idea that survival could include moments of humanity, however rare. The days passed, and the incident refused to fade. It was referenced casually at first, then more openly. Like the pizza, someone would say when rations arrived, half joking. The word itself became shorthand for something unspoken, a reminder that the world was not as rigid as it appeared. Guards noticed the change too. The prisoners were not suddenly obedient or cheerful, but there was less hostility in their eyes, less of the coiled resentment that had once been constant. For some, the shift brought guilt. They worried that accepting kindness meant betraying comrades still fighting, or dishonoring those already lost. These thoughts surfaced late at night, sharp and accusatory. But even guilt could not erase the fact that the experience had happened. It had been real, and once something real contradicts belief, belief must either harden dangerously or bend. The pizza did not create trust overnight, but it cracked the surface. It made space for nuance in a place where nuance rarely survived. The prisoners began to see captivity not only as punishment, but as a strange limbo governed by individual choices rather than faceless cruelty. The war was still the war. The enemy was still the enemy. Yet the lines had blurred just enough to make absolute hatred difficult to maintain. In that sense, the food had done something remarkable. It had forced men trained for obedience and endurance to confront ambiguity. It challenged the simplicity of propaganda with the complexity of lived experience. And in doing so, it planted a quiet seed, one that would continue to grow unseen, long after the taste itself had faded from memory. Years later, when the surviving prisoners recounted their experiences in memoirs, interviews, and whispered conversations over post-war drinks, the story of that single meal often came first, before battles, before losses, before the fear and cold of captivity. It was a memory that had lodged itself in the mind with an almost disproportionate significance, because it was not merely about hunger being satiated, but about the collapse of certainty in a world that had been meticulously categorized into friend and enemy, right and wrong, survival and extinction. For many, the recollection of warm bread, melted cheese, and the shock of sweet pineapple became a kind of touchstone, a sensory marker around which memories of human complexity could gather. The war had taught them to expect cruelty, to anticipate deception at every turn, and yet in that brief, sunlit tent under the canvas roof, none of those lessons held true. That reality forced them to reconsider not just the nature of their captors, but their own perceptions, their own assumptions, their own hearts. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the days immediately following the meal. Men who had once regarded the Allied guards with relentless suspicion began to notice small things: a nod, a refusal to rush them during roll calls, moments of silence instead of verbal aggression. The effect was cumulative, layered, quiet. They did not become naive or unguarded, but a new pattern emerged, one in which humanity coexisted with hierarchy, where choice and kindness could exist even amidst the machinery of war. The pizza, trivial in its physical form, yet immense in its symbolic power, had become a conduit for that realization. Every chew, every shared glance across the table, had chipped away at rigid structures of thought. Men who had lived under strict doctrines, who had internalized narratives of enemy cruelty and absolute obedience, were suddenly faced with a dissonance that refused simplification. The impact extended beyond the moment, stretching like ripples across time and circumstance. In conversations that followed, prisoners found themselves speaking of the meal as though it had been a moral test, a revelation, a glimpse of a world that could exist beyond black and white categories. One prisoner recounted in a journal the way he had closed his eyes while chewing, the unfamiliar sweetness of pineapple forcing him to remember childhood kitchens, the smell of bread baking in small ovens, the laughter of siblings over trivial games. These memories, long buried under the weight of combat, reemerged, vivid and unbidden, triggered by taste. The experience was almost disorienting, because it reminded them that identity and memory were not solely determined by wartime circumstance. They were malleable, capable of being shaped by something as simple as the deliberate act of offering food. Even the guards themselves became part of this unspoken transformation. Though they did not participate in the meal, their presence, calm, patient, non-threatening, had reinforced the lesson. The prisoners could see in their posture and expression that authority did not always equate to cruelty, that discipline could coexist with respect, and that choice was a currency more potent than fear. The tent, with its warm, lingering smells and soft light filtering through canvas seams, had become a crucible in which assumptions about enemy behavior were tested and reformed. And as the weeks passed, the prisoners carried that understanding forward, interpreting small gestures, subtle shifts, and nuanced interactions through the lens of the moment when sweetness and kindness had arrived unannounced. The long-term effects were both psychological and emotional. Men who had been rigid in outlook began to question the rigid hierarchy of wartime morality, realizing that decisions were not always dictated solely by ideology or orders. A previously defiant prisoner, recalling the texture of the crust and the interplay of sweet and savory, reflected that such experiences demonstrated the complexity of human nature, that acts of generosity could occur even in a context designed for suppression and control. Another described, decades later, the way he had internally reconfigured his understanding of captivity. No longer was the camp solely a place of confinement and fear. It was also a space in which humanity could surface, however fleetingly, and in that moment, choice and moral clarity became accessible. This understanding subtly altered interactions within the camp as well. Men spoke with one another in tones less harsh, their judgments of fellow prisoners tempered by an awareness that kindness was possible even in unlikely circumstances. Arguments over rations or space, once fraught with tension and aggression, were softened by an unspoken reminder that small acts of decency could exist alongside scarcity and hierarchy. It became clear that the meaning of captivity was not fixed. While physical conditions remained arduous, psychological landscapes shifted. The memory of that meal offered a blueprint for interpreting the world through a lens that allowed for complexity, nuance, and the acknowledgement of human dignity. The ripple effects did not end with the prisoners' own perception. They extended into their post-war lives. Many men, upon returning home, recounted the story to family, friends, and eventually historians, not as a footnote, but as a central anecdote. They spoke of it not in triumphalist terms, but with the quiet awe reserved for events that challenge assumptions, upend expectation, and quietly alter the understanding of what it means to be human. The story of the pineapple on pizza became emblematic, a moment when enemy and captive were temporarily unmade, revealing a shared vulnerability and a fleeting but undeniable sense of connection. They remembered how the act did not erase the horrors of war, nor did it absolve anyone of guilt, loss, or suffering. Yet it softened the edges of their narrative, introducing an element of choice, generosity, and unpredictability in a world that had often seemed determined to suppress such things. Psychologically, the meal illustrated the profound effect that sensory experiences can have on perception. The smell, warmth, and taste of the pizza became intertwined with emotional memory, creating a multi-layered impression that could not be erased by subsequent hardship or monotony. Even years later, when describing the event, veterans would close their eyes and trace the shape of the tray, the glisten of melted cheese, the unexpected juiciness of the pineapple chunks. The vividness of these details underscored the depth of the impact, revealing that in times of deprivation, even small gestures could resonate far beyond their immediate context, altering not only mood, but moral and cognitive frameworks. Moreover, the episode underscored the limitations of wartime ideology and propaganda. For men steeped in the narratives of enemy cruelty and absolute obedience, the act of receiving something as simple as pizza without expectation or deception forced them to acknowledge that not all behavior could be predicted, that human choices were not bound by circumstance alone. This realization, subtle though it was, planted seeds of empathy, reflection, and moral recalibration. It demonstrated that understanding and even reconciliation could emerge not through confrontation or argument, but through shared experience and the sensory immediacy of sustenance. In the end, the meal served as a quiet pivot point, a moment of unanticipated moral and emotional resonance in a landscape otherwise dominated by fear, discipline, and uncertainty. Its effects persisted through years of captivity, post-war reflection, and retelling. The pizza and pineapple did not change the outcome of battles or alter the strategic realities of the war, but they did transform perception, forging a fragile human connection that defied context, challenged preconceptions, and revealed the enduring capacity for kindness and understanding even amidst the harshest circumstances. And for every man who had tasted that moment, the memory became a permanent lens through which they viewed both history and humanity, a reminder that even in the midst of devastation, the simplest gestures could illuminate the profoundest truths.